If a man with power raises his voice and nothing moves, who truly holds control? The morning air sat cold and thin across the camp, the kind of early hour where sound carried farther than it should, where even a single boot step could echo like a warning across open ground. Rows of women stood aligned in silence, gray uniforms still damp from the night chill, their breath faint in the air, their eyes forward, trained by routine, by survival, by the unspoken understanding that stillness was safety. And then it came. A voice sharp enough to cut through everything. Sergeant Daniel Carter, tall, rigid, his presence known before he spoke, but undeniable once he did, his words snapping across the yard with a force that made shoulders tighten and spine straighten. He was not a cruel man, not by intention, but discipline lived in his voice, authority sat in his chest, and control was the language he trusted most. A small mistake had triggered it, nothing significant, a delay, a hesitation, something out of rhythm, but in a place like this, rhythm was everything, and when it broke, he corrected it, immediately, loudly, decisively. The women did not react beyond what was expected, heads lowered slightly, bodies still, eyes avoiding his, all except one. Anna Weiss stood 3 rows back, not centered, not meant to be seen, yet something about her remained untouched by the wave that moved through the others. Her shoulders did not dip, her breath did not quicken, her gaze did not drop. She did not challenge him, did not defy him, but she did not yield either. And that difference, that almost invisible refusal to shrink, created a space around her that did not belong to the rest of the yard. Carter noticed, not at first, not immediately, but something in the stillness drew his attention, like a note out of tune in an otherwise perfect line. He stepped closer, boots pressing into gravel with deliberate weight, 6 feet away, then 5, then 3, his voice rising again, directed now, focused, expecting the usual response, a nod, a quick answer, an apology shaped by fear or habit, something to confirm the structure he relied on. But Anna did not move, not a fraction. Her hands remained at her sides, her posture unchanged, her face calm, not cold, not distant, just steady, and the longer she remained that way, the more the moment stretched. The sound of his own voice began to feel misplaced, too loud, too sharp against something that refused to echo it back. The air shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Carter to feel it, not as defiance, but as absence, absence of fear, absence of reaction, absence of everything he expected to control. And for a brief second, one that passed without announcement, his voice paused, not fully gone, not yet softened, but interrupted by something he could not immediately name, because standing in front of him was not resistance, not rebellion, but something far more unsettling, composure, and it held its ground without saying a word. The pause did not last long, but it was long enough to be noticed, not by everyone, not by the entire line, but by the few who understood how rare it was for a man like Carter to hesitate. His jaw tightened slightly as if correcting something internal, something invisible, and when he spoke again the volume returned, but not the same edge, not the same sharpness that had cut through the air moments before. It was controlled now, measured, as though he was choosing each word instead of releasing them. You, he said, directing it clearly at Anna, expecting at least a nod, a flicker, a signal of compliance, but she remained exactly as she had been, not frozen, not rigid, just present. Her eyes met his briefly, not long enough to challenge, not short enough to avoid, and then settled back to neutral, the kind of gaze that did not invite conflict and did not retreat from it either. Carter took another step closer, close enough now to notice details that had been lost at a distance, the steadiness in her breathing, the absence of tension in her hands, the way her shoulders held their position without strain. It was not practiced obedience, it was something else, something that did not depend on him, and that realization unsettled him more than open resistance ever could, because resistance could be corrected, resistance could be answered, but this quiet, grounded stillness offered nothing to push against, no surface for authority to land on, and for a moment he searched for the right command, the one that would restore the structure of the scene, the one that would bring everything back into alignment. But the words did not come as easily. Behind him, the line remained silent, the women aware of the shift even if they could not name it. The air felt heavier now, not with fear, but with attention, as if something important was happening beneath the surface of a routine moment. Carter inhaled slowly, a controlled breath, and then asked, not demanded, "Do you understand the instructions?" The question hung differently in the air. It did not strike, it settled. Anna answered this time, her voice low. Clear, unhurried, yes, no hesitation, no embellishment, just the word, complete on its own, and it carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could, because it matched her posture, her presence, her refusal to be anything other than composed. Carter studied her for a second longer, not as a guard evaluating a prisoner, but as a man trying to understand something he had not expected to encounter here. Not in this place, not in this context, and then he nodded, a small motion, almost unnoticeable, but final. Then follow them, he said, and stepped back, creating space where there had been pressure just moments before. The line adjusted slightly, the invisible tension easing without breaking formation. Routine resumed, instructions continued, but something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the way his voice carried across the yard. It no longer needed to rise as high. It no longer pressed as hard, and as the morning moved forward, those who paid attention could feel it, a difference without announcement, a change without explanation, and at the center of it stood a woman who had done nothing more than remain exactly who she was. By midday the sun had burned through the morning chill, heat settling over the yard in a slow, steady weight that pressed against skin and fabric alike. The routine moved forward as it always did, measured steps, assigned tasks, the quiet rhythm of controlled movement across open ground. Yet something remained different, not visible, not spoken, but present in the way sound carried, in the way orders were given and received. Sergeant Carter walked the perimeter as he had done every day before. Boots marking time across gravel and packed dirt, his posture unchanged, his uniform precise, but his attention lingered longer than usual, not on the line as a whole, but on moments, small details that would have gone unnoticed before, a hand adjusting a sleeve, a pause before lifting a crate, a glance exchanged between two women. He observed without interruption, without correction, as though he was measuring something new, recalibrating a system he had trusted without question. Anna Weiss worked among the others, her movements efficient, consistent, nothing that demanded attention, nothing that invited it. And yet Carter found himself aware of where she was without needing to look directly, as if her presence had created a reference point in the space, a quiet constant against which everything else shifted. At one point a younger woman struggled with the weight of a wooden box, her grip uncertain, her balance off by just enough to slow the line. In previous days Carter would have stepped in immediately, voice raised, correction issued before hesitation could spread, but this time he watched for a second longer. Long enough to see Anna move half a step closer, not dramatic, not announced. Just enough to steady the edge of the box with one hand. The motion was subtle, almost invisible, the kind of help that did not call attention to itself. The younger woman adjusted, regained control, and the line continued without disruption. Carter did not speak, he did not need to, because what he saw was not disorder, it was something else, something that did not rely on force to maintain it. And that recognition stayed with him as the afternoon stretched on, the heat rising into the high 70s, the air thick, the pace steady. When the whistle signaled a short break, the women moved to the shaded edge of the yard, sitting or standing in quiet clusters, conserving energy, speaking in low tones or not at all. Carter remained standing, a few yards away, not intruding, not engaging, just present, his canteen in hand. He took a measured sip, then another, his gaze drifting, not searching, until it settled briefly on Anna again. She sat on a low wooden bench, back straight, hands resting lightly in her lap, not slouched, not rigid, simply composed, as if the conditions around her did not dictate her posture, as if she carried her own structure within her. And for the first time since he had been assigned to this camp, Carter questioned something he had never needed to question before, not the rules, not the procedures, but the assumption beneath them, the belief that control required pressure, that order required volume, that compliance was the only form of stability. The afternoon light shifted, stretching shadows longer across the ground, and when the break ended, he gave the signal, not louder, not sharper, just clear, and it was enough. The line reformed, the work resumed, and no one needed to be told twice, because something had already been understood without being said. And as the day moved toward evening, Carter realized that whatever had changed that morning had not faded with time, it had settled, quietly, firmly, into the way the camp now breathed. Evening arrived without announcement, the light softening across the camp as the sun dropped low behind the fence line, shadows stretching long and thin across the packed earth, the air cooling just enough to ease the weight of the day. The final tasks were completed in near silence, tools returned, lines reformed, movements precise but no longer tense. Sergeant Carter stood near the main gate, hands behind his back, watching the last formation of the day settle into place. There was no need to raise his voice, not now, not after what he had seen unfold since morning. He gave the final instruction clearly, evenly, and it carried, not because it was loud, but because it was understood. The women responded in unison, stepping forward, then halting exactly where expected, the rhythm held without force, as if something invisible guided it. Carter's gaze moved across the line, not searching for mistakes, but observing the absence of them, and then it paused, just briefly, on Anna Weiss. She stood where she always did, neither forward nor behind, her presence unchanged by the day, her posture the same quiet alignment she had held from the beginning. Nothing in her expression suggested awareness of the shift she had created, nothing in her stance claimed it, and that, more than anything, stayed with him, because influence without intention was something he had never been trained to recognize, never been taught to measure. The dismissal was given, the line broke, small groups moved toward the barracks, footsteps softer now, voices low, the sound of the day winding down. Carter remained where he was for a moment longer than necessary, the yard emptying in front of him, the space opening, and in that quiet he replayed the morning, not as a sequence of events, but as a feeling, the exact moment his voice had met something it could not move, something it could not shape or direct, and instead of breaking it, it had broken something else, something in him, not in a way that weakened, but in a way that revealed, the assumption that control was the same as order, that volume was the same as authority. Those ideas felt less certain now, less complete. He turned slowly, beginning his walk along the fence, the wire catching the last light of the day, a thin line of gold against the darkening sky. The camp looked the same, nothing structural had changed, the routines would repeat tomorrow as they always had, the rules remained, the boundaries held, but the tone had shifted, subtle, quiet, almost unnoticeable unless you were listening for it, and Carter was. He reached the corner post and stopped, looking back across the yard one last time. The bench where Anna had sat now empty, the ground marked only by the faint impressions of boots and steps, temporary traces of a day that would not be recorded, would not be reported, but would remain, in the way voices were used, in the way silence was understood. And as the last light faded, he made a decision that did not require words, that did not need to be written down. The next morning, he would step into the yard the same man in uniform, but not the same man in practice. Because somewhere between a raised voice and a quiet answer, something had shifted, and it was not going back. Morning came again with the same pale light stretching across the camp, the same cold air resting low against the ground, the same routine waiting to begin, but something beneath it had already shifted, something that could not be seen from a distance. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped into the yard at exactly the same time as the day before, boots steady, uniform precise, nothing outwardly different. Yet his pace slowed just slightly as he reached his usual position, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but awareness. The line of women formed as expected, rows straight, posture aligned, the quiet discipline of repetition holding everything together, and as he looked across them, his eyes did not scan for error first, they observed presence, a subtle change in focus that altered what he noticed. Anna Weiss stood where she always stood, neither forward nor hidden, her stillness unchanged, her gaze steady in the same quiet way. Carter gave the first instruction, clear, even, and it carried without resistance, no need for force, no need for volume. The line responded with the same precision as before, but the tension that had once lived in the space between command and action was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that held without pressure. The morning progressed, tasks assigned, movements executed, and Carter found himself speaking less, not because control was lost, but because it was no longer demanded in the same way. When a delay occurred, a small misstep in timing, he did not raise his voice, he stepped closer, spoke once, calmly, and it was enough. The correction made, the rhythm restored, no ripple of tension, no tightening of shoulders, just adjustment, smooth and immediate. And for the first time he noticed how much energy had once been spent maintaining a system that now seemed to hold itself, not perfectly, but naturally. During a brief pause he stood near the edge of the yard, watching the line shift positions, his hands resting at his sides instead of locked behind his back, a small change, almost insignificant, yet it reflected something deeper, a release of rigidity that had defined him for years. Anna moved through her task with the same quiet efficiency, never drawing attention, never seeking it, and yet her presence remained a fixed point in the space, not because she commanded it, but because she did not need to. Carter understood something now that had not been clear before: authority did not always begin with sound, sometimes it began with restraint, sometimes it existed without announcement, and sometimes it came from those who never claimed it at all. As the sun rose higher, warming the ground into the mid-70s, the camp moved with a rhythm that felt different, not looser, not uncontrolled, but balanced, the kind of balance that did not rely on force to sustain itself. And Carter, standing in the center of it, realized that what had changed was not the rules, not the structure, but the way he carried them, the way he delivered them, the way he understood them. And as he gave the next instruction, his voice steady, measured, he knew without needing to say it that something had been redefined, not by command, not by correction, but by a moment of silence that had shown him a different kind of strength. By the third day the difference could no longer be dismissed as a passing shift. It had settled into the rhythm of the camp like a new baseline, quiet but consistent, something that did not demand attention yet shaped everything it touched. Sergeant Daniel Carter noticed it first in the way sound behaved, how instructions no longer needed to rise above the air to be heard, how a single clear sentence carried farther than a raised voice ever had. The yard responded differently now, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Movements aligned without urgency, corrections happened without disruption, and the space between command and action had grown smaller, more direct, as if something unnecessary had been removed. He walked his usual path along the line, boots pressing into the same ground, the same measured pace, yet his presence no longer pushed against the environment, it moved with it. When he paused near a group adjusting their work assignments, he did not interrupt. Immediately, he observed, giving the moment a second to resolve on its own, and it did. A quiet exchange, a shift of position, a task corrected without instruction. Carter said nothing, not because he was unaware, but because he recognized that not every correction required his voice, and that realization, simple as it seemed, marked a change deeper than any order he had ever given. Anna Weiss continued as she always had, steady, composed, her actions unchanged by the evolving tone around her. She did not lead, did not instruct, did not draw others toward her, and yet there was a subtle influence in the way those near her moved, a kind of calm efficiency that spread without being directed. Carter saw it in small details, the way a tool was passed without hesitation, the way a task was shared without discussion, the way tension never had the chance to build because it was met early, quietly, and resolved before it needed to escalate. During the midday break the temperature climbed into the low 80s, the air heavier now, carrying the scent of dry earth and sun-warmed wood. The women rested in the shade, conserving energy for the remaining hours. Carter stood at a distance, his canteen in hand, watching the patterns of movement, the absence of friction, and he understood that what he was seeing was not compliance in the traditional sense, it was something more stable, something that did not depend on pressure to hold its form. His gaze moved across the yard and found Anna again, not intentionally, not deliberately, but naturally, as if his attention had learned where to settle. She sat as she had before, posture straight, hands relaxed, her presence unaffected by the heat, by the day, by the system around her. And in that consistency he saw something he had overlooked for years, strength that did not announce itself, authority that did not require recognition, and for the first time he considered that the most effective form of control might not come from imposing structure, but from creating the conditions where structure could exist on its own. The whistle sounded, the break ended, and the line reformed with quiet precision. Carter gave the next instruction, his voice even, his tone steady, and it was followed immediately, not out of obligation, but out of alignment. And as the afternoon unfolded, he no longer measured success by how quickly his orders were obeyed, but by how little they needed to be repeated. And in that shift, subtle yet complete, he realized that what had changed in the camp was not the discipline, but the understanding of it, and it had begun not with a command, but with a moment where no command had been answered. On the fourth morning the sky came in low and gray, a thin layer of cloud softening the light across the camp, muting the edges of everything, the air cooler than the days before, carrying a stillness that made even small movements feel more defined. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped into the yard as he always did, but this time he paused before giving the first instruction, not long, just a second longer than usual. As if listening for something beneath the quiet, the line formed in front of him. With the same precision, the same discipline, yet without the tightness that had once accompanied it, there was no visible strain, no forced alignment, just readiness, and when he spoke, his voice did not need to rise, it moved across the yard evenly, settling into place rather than striking against it. The response came immediately, synchronized, controlled, but no longer rigid. The difference was subtle, but it was there, and Carter felt it in the way the moment held together without effort. As the morning tasks began, he found himself moving differently through the space, not inspecting in the way he once had, not searching for errors to correct, but observing the flow of work as it developed, and in that flow he noticed something he had not expected, a kind of quiet communication that existed without words, a shared awareness among the women that allowed them to adjust before problems fully formed, a shift in weight, a glance, a half step forward or back, and the task realigned itself. Carter did not interrupt, because there was nothing to interrupt. The system was functioning, not under pressure, but through understanding, and that realization stayed with him as he moved along the line. When he reached Anna Weiss, she was in the middle of her task, hands steady, movements measured, her attention focused but not strained. She did not look up when he approached, not out of avoidance, but because there was no need. Her work spoke for itself, and for a moment Carter stood there, not saying anything, not issuing a command, just observing the consistency of her presence, the way she remained unchanged regardless of who stood in front of her, and he understood then that what had affected him days before had not been an isolated moment. It was a pattern, a way of being that did not shift under pressure, did not react to volume, did not depend on external force to maintain its form, and that kind of steadiness, once seen, could not be unseen. Later in the morning a minor delay occurred at the far end of the yard, a misalignment in timing that caused a brief pause in movement. Carter turned toward it instinctively, his body prepared to step in, to correct, to restore order in the way he always had, but he stopped, not because he chose not to act, but because he saw something else happen first. The women adjusted, quietly, without instruction. One shifted position, another compensated, and within seconds the rhythm returned, smooth, uninterrupted, as if the delay had never fully formed. Carter remained where he was, watching the space settle back into alignment, and for the first time he recognized that control did not always need to come from him, that order could emerge from within the system itself when it was not constantly pressed from above. The realization did not diminish his role, it redefined it. As the day continued, the light shifting slowly behind the clouds, the temperature holding steady in the mid-60s, the camp moved with a calm precision that felt sustainable, not forced, and Carter, standing within it, understood that what had begun as a single moment of silence had become something larger, something that extended beyond one interaction, beyond one person, shaping the way everything now functioned. And as he gave the next instruction, his voice even, his tone steady, he no longer measured authority by how strongly it was delivered, but by how naturally it was received. By the fifth day the change had moved beyond observation and settled into expectation, not spoken, not announced, but present in the way each morning began without resistance. The sky cleared again, sunlight returning in long, steady lines across the yard, warming the ground into the low 70s by mid-morning. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped into position and gave the first instruction without pause, without build-up. And the response came immediately, not sharper, not faster, just smoother. As if the space between his words and their actions had shortened to almost nothing, he walked the line with a pace that matched the rhythm around him, no longer ahead of it, no longer forcing it forward, and in that alignment he noticed something he had missed before, the way attention flowed across the group, not fixed, not scattered, but shared, each person aware not only of her own task, but of the movement of those beside her. Adjustments happening in small increments, barely visible, yet enough to prevent disruption before it formed. Carter paused near the center of the yard, his gaze steady, his presence quiet, and for a moment he did nothing. He did not speak, he did not step in, he allowed the scene to continue without interference, and it held, not perfectly, but reliably. The structure remained, the pace consistent, the need for correction minimal. And in that stillness he understood something that had been building since the first morning, that control was not the act of constant correction, but the ability to step back without losing order. Anna Weiss moved through her work with the same measured calm, her actions unchanged, her pace steady, yet there was a clarity in the way she approached each task, as if nothing outside of it altered her focus. Carter watched her for a moment longer than usual, not with suspicion, not with evaluation, but with recognition, the kind that comes when something familiar reveals itself in a new way. He saw now that her strength was not in resistance, but in consistency, not in reaction, but in presence. And that kind of steadiness had a way of shaping the environment around it without effort. Later in the morning, a supply cart arrived slightly off schedule, the timing creating a brief uncertainty in the flow of work. Carter turned toward it, his instinct ready to reorganize, to reassert timing through instruction, but he stopped, again, not out of hesitation, but out of observation. The women adjusted, a path cleared, tasks shifted, the cart integrated into the movement without interruption, no raised voices, no sharp commands, just alignment, and Carter felt the difference clearly now, the absence of friction, the quiet efficiency that replaced it. During the midday break he remained standing near the edge of the yard, the sunlight filtering through the fence casting long, narrow shadows across the ground. He took a slow drink from his canteen, the water cool, steady, and his gaze moved across the space with a different kind of attention, not searching for what was wrong, but noticing what was working. And in that shift he found something unexpected, a sense of ease, not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of balance, the understanding that authority did not need to press constantly to remain effective, that sometimes it could exist in restraint, in clarity, in the space it allowed rather than the pressure it applied. The whistle sounded, the break ended, and as the line reformed with quiet precision, Carter gave the next instruction in the same measured tone, and it was followed without delay, without tension, as if it had already been understood before it was spoken. And in that moment he realized that what had begun as a single, silent refusal had become something far more lasting, a change not in rules, not in structure, but in the way both were carried, and it was holding, day after day, without needing to be forced. On the sixth day the sky opened wide and clear, a deep blue stretching above the camp without interruption, the sunlight sharper now, casting defined edges across every surface, the air warming quickly into the mid-70s by late morning, and with it came a clarity that seemed to settle not only over the land but within the rhythm of the camp itself. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped into the yard, and for a moment he did not speak, not because he hesitated, but because he no longer needed to begin with sound. The line had already formed, already aligned, already present, and when he finally gave the first instruction, it moved across the space without resistance, as if it belonged there. The response came in the same quiet precision that had defined the past few days, but now it felt established, not new, not fragile, something that had taken root. Carter walked the perimeter slowly, his attention steady, not searching for what might go wrong, but observing how consistently things were going right. And in that observation he noticed something else, something more subtle. The absence of anticipation, the absence of that slight tension that once lived in the moments before he spoke. The women no longer braced for his voice, they did not prepare for correction, they simply worked, and that shift, small as it appeared, changed the entire atmosphere. It allowed the space to breathe, to hold its structure without tightening against it. Anna Weiss remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, her movements unchanged, her pace steady, her presence grounded in a way that did not fluctuate with the environment. Carter saw her again without needing to look for her, as if his awareness had learned its own path. She adjusted a stack of supplies with careful precision, aligning each piece without hurry, without waste, and when another woman approached uncertainly, Anna did not instruct, did not signal, she simply shifted slightly, creating space, and the other woman followed. The task completed without a word, without interruption. Carter watched this from a distance, understanding now that influence did not always announce itself, that it could exist in the smallest adjustments, in the quiet spaces between actions, and that realization stayed with him as the morning continued. Later, a minor miscommunication occurred near the far side of the yard, two tasks overlapping briefly, creating a moment of uncertainty. Carter turned toward it, his instinct ready to intervene, to clarify, to restore order through direction. But he paused, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. The pattern was familiar now, the space held, the women adjusted, one stepped back, another moved forward, the overlap resolved before it fully formed. and the rhythm continued uninterrupted. Carter did not move, he did not speak, because there was nothing left to correct, and in that moment he understood fully that his role had changed, not diminished, but refined. It was no longer about constant presence in every action, but about knowing when presence was no longer required. During the midday break he stood at the edge of the yard, the sunlight warm against his shoulders, the air steady, and for the first time in years he felt no need to fill the silence. It existed on its own, complete, the camp functioned within it, and he allowed it to remain. His gaze moved once more across the space, settling briefly on Anna, not as a point of focus, but as a point of understanding, and he realized that what had begun as a single moment of stillness had grown into something larger than any instruction he had ever given, something that did not depend on him, yet had changed the way he led. And as the whistle sounded and the line reformed with quiet precision, he gave the next instruction in the same measured tone, knowing now that authority did not need to be louder to be stronger, it only needed to be clear enough to be understood. On the seventh day the pattern no longer felt like a change at all, it felt like the way things had always been meant to operate. The morning opened with a steady light, the sun rising clean over the fence line, the air warming gradually into the low 70s, and the camp moved into motion without hesitation. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped into position and did not rush to speak, he allowed the line to settle fully, to find its own alignment before adding his voice, and when he did, it was quiet, clear, and immediate. The response came without delay, not sharper, not faster, just exact, as if every movement had already been decided before the words were spoken. He walked along the line with a slower pace than before, not because he was less attentive, but because there was less to correct. His presence no longer pressed against the space, it moved within it, observing rather than directing, and in that observation he noticed something that had not been visible in the early days, a kind of confidence, not loud, not outward, but present in the way the women carried themselves, shoulders steady, movements deliberate, attention focused without strain. The absence of pressure had not weakened discipline, it had refined it. Anna Weiss continued her work with the same quiet consistency, her actions unchanged by the passage of days, yet now her presence felt less like an exception and more like a foundation, something that had been there from the beginning, unnoticed until everything else adjusted around it. Carter saw how others moved near her, not following, not imitating, but aligning naturally, as if her steadiness provided a reference point that did not need to be explained. Later in the morning a new guard entered the yard, recently assigned. Unfamiliar with the rhythm that had developed, his voice carried sharper, louder, cutting across the space in a way that felt out of place. The line reacted subtly, not with fear, but with a slight tightening, a brief disruption in the flow. Carter turned toward the sound, not immediately intervening, but watching. The new guard issued a correction, louder than necessary, repeating it when the response did not match his expectation. And in that moment Carter recognized the pattern he had once followed, the assumption that volume ensured control. He stepped forward then, not quickly, not abruptly, but with intention, his presence enough to shift the focus. He spoke once, calmly, clearly, the same instruction delivered in a different tone, and the response came immediately, the line adjusting without resistance, the tension dissolving as quickly as it had formed. The new guard fell silent, not corrected, not reprimanded, but observing, just as Carter had once observed. And in that exchange something passed between them, not through words, but through demonstration, the understanding that authority did not need to be louder to be effective, it needed to be understood. The moment moved on, the rhythm restored, and the yard returned to its steady flow. Carter resumed his position, his gaze steady, his movements measured, and as the day continued he realized that what had begun as a personal shift had extended beyond him. It had become part of the environment, something others could see, could learn from, without instruction. During the midday break the air warmed further, the sun high above casting shorter shadows. Carter stood near the fence, his posture relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable days before, and as he looked across the yard, his attention settled briefly on Anna once more, not as a point of curiosity, but as a point of clarity, and he understood that the most significant changes rarely arrived with force. They arrived quietly, held their ground, and allowed everything else to adjust around them. And as the whistle sounded and the line reformed, he gave the next instruction in the same steady tone, knowing now that what mattered was not how strongly it was delivered, but how naturally it was received. On the eighth day the air carried a quiet steadiness that no longer felt new. it felt settled, as if the camp itself had adjusted to a rhythm that required less effort to maintain. The morning unfolded without resistance, the line formed with the same quiet precision, and Sergeant Daniel Carter stood before it without the need to assert anything beyond presence. He gave the first instruction in a tone that matched the stillness around him, and it was followed without delay, not out of habit, but out of alignment. The yard moved as a single system, not rigid, not forced, but connected in a way that allowed each part to respond without waiting for pressure. Carter walked the perimeter slowly, his attention not fixed on errors, but on continuity, on how each moment carried into the next without disruption, and in that continuity he noticed something deeper, a sense of ownership among the women, not spoken, not declared, but visible in the way they handled their tasks, the care in their movements, the consistency in their pace. It was no longer something imposed from above, it existed within the structure itself. Anna Weiss remained unchanged, her presence steady as it had been from the beginning, but now the space around her reflected that same steadiness, as if what she carried had extended outward, shaping not only her own actions but the environment in which they occurred. Carter observed her briefly, not searching for meaning, but recognizing it when it appeared. She adjusted a small detail in her work, a minor alignment that prevented a larger correction later, and he understood that this was how the system now held itself, through small, precise actions that removed the need for larger interventions. Later in the morning the new guard returned, his movements more measured this time, his voice lower, closer to the tone Carter had used the day before. He gave an instruction once, clearly, and waited, and when the response came as expected, he did not repeat it, he did not raise his voice, he simply observed, learning in real time what could not be explained through orders alone. Carter noticed this and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The shift was already happening, not through correction, but through example. During the midday break the sun stood high, the air warm but not heavy, the yard quiet in a way that felt complete. Carter stood near the fence, his posture relaxed, his hands no longer fixed in a rigid position, and for a moment he allowed himself to stand without evaluating, without measuring, just present in the space as it functioned on its own. His gaze moved across the yard and settled briefly on Anna once more, not because she stood out, but because she did not need to. Her consistency had become part of the foundation, something that no longer required attention to exist, and in that realization Carter understood that the most lasting changes were not those that demanded recognition, but those that quietly redefined what was normal. The whistle sounded, the break ended, and as the line reformed with the same quiet precision, Carter gave the next instruction in the same steady tone, knowing now that authority was not something he had to prove, it was something he had to carry, and when carried correctly, it required very little to be understood. On the 9th day the change no longer belonged to any single moment, it had become part of the structure itself, woven into the way the camp moved, the way sound traveled, the way silence was held without tension. The morning light arrived soft and even, spreading across the yard without sharp edges, and with it came a rhythm that no longer needed to be established, it simply continued. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped into position and for a brief moment he stood without speaking, not out of habit, but because there was nothing to initiate. The line was already there, already aligned, already present in a way that required no correction. When he gave the first instruction his voice carried with the same steady clarity, and the response followed immediately, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with certainty, the kind that did not need reinforcement. He walked the line slowly, his attention moving across the space without searching, without anticipating disruption, because there was none, and in that absence he noticed something more refined. The way each action connected seamlessly to the next, the way tasks flowed without interruption, not because they were forced into place, but because they had been understood at a level that no longer required constant direction. Anna Weiss remained where she had always been, her presence unchanged, her movements consistent, yet now she no longer appeared as a contrast to the system, she appeared as part of its foundation, something that had always been there, only now fully recognized. Carter watched as she adjusted a small detail in her work, aligning it with quiet precision, preventing what would have once required correction, and in that single action he saw the entire shift reflected. Control had moved from reaction to anticipation, from correction to awareness. Later in the morning the new guard approached him, not formally, not with questions, but with a glance that carried uncertainty. Carter did not instruct, did not explain, he simply nodded once toward the line, toward the movement of the yard, and the new guard watched, observing the same patterns Carter had come to understand: the absence of raised voices, the presence of steady direction, the way a single instruction was enough when it was delivered with clarity, and in that observation the lesson transferred without words. During the midday break the air warmed into the high 70s, the sunlight steady, the yard quiet in a way that felt complete. Carter stood near the fence, his posture no longer defined by rigidity, his presence grounded in a way that did not rely on formality to be recognized, and for a moment he allowed himself to stand without purpose, without evaluation, simply present in the space as it functioned on its own. His gaze moved across the yard and settled briefly on Anna, not as a point of focus, but as a point of understanding, and he realized that what had begun as a single moment of stillness had become something that could not be undone, not because it was enforced, but because it had revealed something more effective than what had come before. The whistle sounded, the break ended, and as the line reformed with the same quiet precision, Carter gave the next instruction in the same steady tone, knowing now that authority did not need to assert itself to be felt, it only needed to be carried with enough clarity that it could exist without resistance. On the 10th day nothing announced itself as different, and yet everything carried a quiet finality, the kind that does not arrive with sound but with certainty. The morning unfolded as it had in the days before, the light steady, the air calm, the yard already aligned before a single word was spoken. Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped forward and paused, not out of habit, not out of hesitation, but because there was no longer a need to begin anything. The system had already begun without him, and when he spoke, his voice moved across the space with the same clarity, the same restraint, and it was received in the same way, immediate, precise, complete. He walked the line slowly, his presence no longer a force applied to the environment, but a part of it, integrated, balanced, and as he observed the movement around him, he understood something that could not be written into any manual, something that could not be trained through repetition or enforced through command. That true control did not come from being heard the loudest, but from being understood without needing to be repeated. Anna Weiss stood where she always had, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, her presence as quiet as it had been from the very beginning, and yet now she no longer stood apart from the system. She was within it, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a constant, something that had revealed a different way of holding order. Carter paused a few feet from her, not to question, not to command, but simply to acknowledge, not outwardly, not through gesture, but through recognition, the kind that does not need to be expressed to exist. She did not look at him, did not shift her stance, did not change in any visible way, and that was exactly what remained, that consistency, that refusal to be shaped by pressure, that ability to hold her ground without resistance. And in that stillness Carter found the answer to something he had not known he was asking. Later in the day the routine continued without interruption, tasks completed, movements aligned, the camp functioning with a steadiness that no longer felt fragile or new, but established. And when the final whistle sounded, signaling the end of the day, the line formed one last time, the same quiet precision, the same measured stillness. Carter gave the final instruction of the day, his voice even, his tone clear, and it carried without resistance. The response came as it always did now, immediate, complete, and as the line broke and the women moved back toward the barracks, the yard began to empty, the space opening, returning to stillness. Carter remained where he was for a moment longer, the light fading slowly, the air cooling, and in that quiet he understood that nothing dramatic had occurred, no rule had been rewritten, no system had been overturned, and yet something fundamental had changed, not in the structure, but in the way it was carried, in the space between command and response, in the understanding that had replaced pressure. He turned and began his walk along the fence, the same path he had walked countless times before, but this time with a different awareness, a recognition that what had shifted would not be undone, because it had not been forced into place, it had been revealed. And as the last of the light settled across the yard, leaving it quiet and complete, the lesson remained without needing to be spoken, that the strongest voice in the room is not always the one that rises, but the one that never needed to.